He's the philosopher who cracked open Vladimir Putin's brain. Michael Millerman is here. I'm James Poulos. Welcome to Zero Hour. Michael Millerman is an award-winning political philosophy scholar and teacher. He is one of the foremost experts on Aleksandr Dugin, known as Putin's brain and the most dangerous philosopher in the world. Michael's also leading the online Millerman School. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, let's get all of the filthy political stuff out of the way first, and then we can ascend to the sunny uplands of philosophy. I've followed your stuff for a while. You got into Dugan way in advance of anyone else. You were reading him. You were translating him. You're like one of the very, very vanishingly few guys anywhere in the West who even noticed that maybe there was something interesting or important going on here. Fast forward to today, and right at the top of the news stack, Putin, Dugan, the war, great power conflict is back. Just walk us back to when you first started to get interested. What was your personal stake in what seemed like a very obscure and abstruse Russian philosopher way back when?
Well, for me, he came onto the radar as somebody who was crucial for understanding Russia, because I read an article about him in Azure magazine, which is now defunct, but it said it's what whetted my appetite to study more about him. And what I learned is he was kind of like Kremlin's philosopher king. There was a time when he was expelled from Ukraine, and in response, Putin expelled the Ukrainian ambassador to Russia. And so I read this article and I thought, why is the Kremlin going to bat for a philosopher who also has this strange background and set of interests? Like he's a philosopher who has some importance to the state and to the leadership of the state, which has his back. It's very unusual. I mean, philosophers in the US, philosophers in Canada, they don't have the state at their back. You know, they're not going to go sort of stand up for them. Or
they get a podcast at best.
Yeah, so he was just intriguing to me at first. He was intriguing to me as somebody I personally am interested in Russia, philosophy, mysticism, political theory, religion, theology, the esoteric, the occult, these kinds of topics. And somehow they all are crystallized in him in a very intense and fascinating and intriguing sort of way. So when I saw that, I wanted to learn more. And most of his writings were not available in English, but I speak some Russian because my family's from the former Soviet Union. So I proposed as an undergraduate at that time to translate his works in the context of an academic program. And the first one I found is the first one that ended up being translated and released. It's called The Fourth Political Theory, an idea that's proven to be pretty relevant over the last 10, 11, 12 years since I translated it. So it was just, as I say, intriguing for me, this person. And the more I studied him, the more I saw that not only is he relevant philosophically, not only does he share things about theology and mysticism, as I said, not only does he have an analysis of posthumanism, technology, and what all of these new tendencies mean for the human essence, its preservation or destruction, he's also extremely relevant for understanding Russia's place in the world, Russia's plans, Russia's identity, Russia's vision, Russia's destiny as it interprets itself. And so I would say the last decade has borne that out. Putin is often using Dugin's language in his speeches, language of multipolarity, language of the collapse of the Western liberal global order, language of civilizations, of traditional morality, and these kinds of things. And whether you agree with him or disagree with him, whether you like that or you don't like that, Dugan is a window into what Russia is doing geopolitically, in addition to being these other things that, again, people may find independently interesting.
Sure. So classic Kremlinology question, right? There was a time when he seemed to be especially close to Putin, then maybe not so much anymore. Now as things have heated up, it seems like their rhetoric is converging in certain ways. Can you just help Americans understand sort of like what's the nature of that relationship as far as we can tell?
Yeah. So my view, as far as I know, it's not that Dugan is a personal advisor to Putin. So it's not like, for example, Steve Bannon and Donald Trump at certain times. I don't know that they pick up the phone and talk to one another. But I would say that Dugin's analysis of Russia's potentials, Dugin's interpretation of world events, it has been extremely influential for Putin to draw upon, both when he's looking for justifications for his policies and when he's looking for specific policy directions. So it's almost like when Putin asserts Russia's civilizational identity, he can't but speak the language of Duganism, because Dugan is the most prominent expositor of the view that Russia has a civilizational identity and that the Russian state should follow that version of the world and not try to integrate itself into a global liberal order. So I would say, to my mind at least, from what I understand from people I've spoken with, the influence is indirect, but that can be much more significant than direct influence. The fact that, and let's say an advisor and a president are in the room together talking, doesn't necessarily mean that when the president has to make his decision and take his position, he's not going to draw on, as I say, somehow implicitly or explicitly, the ideas of the most prominent civilizational identity theorist in Russia, the most prominent anti-liberal, anti-Western thinker in Russia. So that's how I see it. I mean, Dugan himself has said that they both read the invisible letters of Russia's destiny in the sky or something like that. People ask him, why do Putin's policies seem so closely to approximate your own analysis? And Dugan says, I just extrapolate, the Russian soul into the future. And when Putin acts consistently, that's what he's going to do. He hasn't always. I mean, you should know, Dugan has a book called Putin versus Putin, where he shows that Putin sometimes has been divided in the past as to whether he's going to take the Russian road or whether he's going to take the Russia's just another Western European country type attitude. And now, the Rubicon has been crossed and Russia's all in on multipolarity, and therefore Dugan's prominence as an interpreter and expositor has increased.
I came up as a political theorist, not a philosopher, of course. As we know, there are significant differences between the two, maybe too obscure for an hour-long interview. But it has been fascinating to see the preoccupations of political theory and philosophy and international relations and grand strategy and, a lot of other things besides. It all seems to kind of be coalescing into this big knot where paradoxically, you can have and you have had Americans across the political spectrum, really for the entirety of this century so far, really just letting it rip with criticism of the United States of America. Whether it's, this is an evil empire, or, it's too many strategic blunders, or racist patriarchy, you name it, the United States of America has been blamed for it since 9/11 or wherever you want to put the pin. But then when you get someone like Dugan or a Putin coming along and advancing some of those same negative characterizations and arguments, sometimes in an even milder form, I must say, then it becomes this is propaganda. They're attacking America. They're trying to destroy us. And sure enough, it must be a pretty cush job to be a Russian propagandist, just sort of lobbing criticisms at America. Like, we all know that we're stepping in it, and it's awkward, it's uncomfortable, and there's a lot of division over what to do about it. But why do you think, from your perch, you're teaching students, you've had an eye on Russia for a long time. I think you probably have a sort of a unique view of the U.S. relative to people who've just been slogging it out, complaining about the same downfall of America for 2 or 3 generations, as so many Americans have. What is your view of why it is that Dugan and Putin and the kind of criticism that they are advancing against America, the West, rules-based international order, whatever you want to call it? Why is that criticism resonating so much with such a broad section of the online critics of America, especially on the right today?
Well, so that's the last thing you said is important. It's on the right, it's resonating because a lot of the anti-Americanism has typically been on the left, and it's been a criticism of capitalism and imperialism, this kind of thing. So the new attraction of Russia in the conservative imagination or on the right, I think stems from a different place. It's that they look like, and again, I'm not saying this is the case, but they can position themselves as a defender of spiritual values, of genuine Christianity, of true religiosity. And in some sense, in Dugan's model, now again, at times I think this might sound more outlandish than it actually is, but in Dugan's model, the trajectory of the West is tending towards the destruction of the human being as such. I mean, we're talking about that, not only the end of history, but the end of humanity. So the human being is at stake in a way that's never been true before, completely. And Russia, not only Russia and its allies, but this gets complicated. They position themselves as defenders. They're going to stop the Western progressive march. They're going to stop the quick headlong jump off the cliff of insanity, where you see signs of it. You don't need me to go through the list. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. So in the past, you had regimes, let's say like Iran, that are anti-Western, anti-liberal, pro-moral, but nobody would say, I mean, it's very rare that you would have an American conservative say, we want to be just like Iran. I mean, that doesn't resonate. But the interesting thing about Russia's position and the interesting thing about Dugin's position is that it is conversant with and couched in the language of things that are closer to the Western spirit and closer to Western interests and identity. So, for example, not only the recovery of a genuine form of Christianity, of religiosity more generally, but even a defense of the classics. Dugan, when he talks about the encroachments of Western liberalism and the desire to overcome Western political modernity, often refers to the need to reestablish an acquaintance with Plato and Aristotle and the classics and Neoplatonism. So that's not what you do if you listen to Iranian religious fanatics. They're
not a lot of Hegel
right?
coming out of Toronto.
Yeah, that's right. Whereas, Dugan has books on Husserl, on Hegel, on Heidegger, on philosophers in the Western tradition, Political Platonism, a book that I translated, and other things like this, where when you're sitting in the United States or in Canada, where I live, and reading Dugan, you don't get the sense that he wants to destroy everything that's dear to us. I mean, I don't get that sense. Rather, there's a kind of overlap in our concern with what's being lost from our world and his analysis of the forces that are responsible for that. I find it difficult to say, okay, we don't also want Plato to be taken seriously. We don't want Aristotle to be taken seriously. We don't want religiosity to be a serious thing. Those are shared interests and shared concerns, I think, that Dugan expresses. So Russia and Dugan as their expositor for this, version, Russia as a civilizational identity and defender of the West, they offer something, I think, unique to the right and to the conservative imagination compared to the typical anti-Americanism of the left and the typical anti-Americanism of fundamentalist anti-American regimes. Here it's kind of like, in fact, he says in his book, The Great Awakening versus the Great Reset, that the Great Awakening will begin in America. And he says many good things about America, about the American people, about American culture, and about the American spirit. Now, he does see the American people as less philosophical than non-Americans, but there's a tradition of that. That's not only not Russian, but also recognized by Americans. Tocqueville's Democracy in America says Americans aren't the most philosophical people. So still, that's one of the things in reading Dugan and thinking about him is the willingness to sort of separate on a nuanced level. At the simplest level, Russia's our enemy. Dugan doesn't like the West. We're the West. It's all bad. But even then, you have to know your enemy and you have to learn from your enemy. So I would say even at the minimal level, there's something there.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the issue, right? Is we do have to deal with the internet. This thing is here and it's not going away. And pretty much anything that you introduce into the internet can be and probably will be oversimplified, caricatured, weaponized, propagandized, used in service of some psyop or another. How worried are you that all of the subtlety, the sophistication, the richness of the corpus of Dugan is just going to, be fed into the internet, and what's going to come out on the other side is going to be something that's just bad for America?
Well, I don't see that that's what's happening. People who are reading Dugan, whether they're in America or out of America, whether they tend to one direction or another direction, what I think they're doing is they're finding intelligent analysis of our problems. They may not share the solutions. They may think they're too vague or too general. But nevertheless, I think he's been helpful to people as an analytical tool. The movement from unipolarity to multipolarity, a lot of people recognize that, but he's got a book, Theory of Multipolarity, a Theory of a Multipolar World, that helps us to understand the details there. And other such phenomena that he just elucidates for his readers. So I've seen that with my students. I mean, typically the people who talk to me about Dugan or have written to me about Dugan, they're not burning American flags. They're not trying to tear down American institutions unless, in a legitimate way that they think the universities are corrupt and so on. But I mean, they are not incendiary radicals. They're thoughtful people who are trying to understand, what is this world that we're in? What's happening to it? What can we make of it? What have we made of it? Where are we going? Where can we go? And Dugan's not the only person they're reading. I mean, they're reading and thinking about other authors, and they're just thoughtful people trying to understand the world and make their way in it. And Dugan contributes to that, I think. So I'm sure that somewhere in the world, he has zealous cult-like followers who, if he tells them to do this, they'll do that. Many sort of intellectual movements risk, becoming concretized and distorted in that way. But by and large, I would say 99%, if not 100% of the people I've talked to about him who've shown an interest in him, they are doing that, trying to understand the world. Sometimes you look from the outside. How does Russia see America? Sometimes you look from the inside. You take criticisms that are from American soil. Cornel West, I was reading recently, a great book on American pragmatism. And the more resources we have to think about, hopefully, the better we can understand the phenomena, figure out what we want to do about them. So that's really what I would say has been the case. I mean, what's doing the most destruction to American cities right now, to American ideas, Canadian cities, Canadian ideas, is not Dugan and his fourth political theory. It's BLM. It's the anti-Israeli marches. It's this leftism that's taken over the universities and the media and other institutions. I would say it's difficult to pin that on Russia, in my opinion. Some people may have their own version of it. It's difficult to pin that on Dugan. There are other sources at play there that he actually helps us to understand. And I think that he can be a part of even, overcoming or objecting to or expressing our criticism of those tendencies.
Well, it's a wild time for philosophy because there are things going on in the world right now that are truly unprecedented. In a sense, everything's just kind of an outworking of what crazy mixed up human beings do to themselves and to one another over time. But you take a look at the position of Russia in the world. You take a look at the position of the U.S. in the world, of China. And what you see is like a lot of really wrenching change. So what's fascinating to me about how Dugan is trying to wrestle with this stuff is Russia's in this kind of strange middle position where, you get these criticisms of, the West has become satanic and America is trying to destroy our humanity. And it can all sound heated and propagandistic, but, there's a lot of talk about the legacy of Francis Fukuyama and his book, The End of History. Well, he wrote another book after that, and it's called Our Posthuman Future. And no one, including Francis Fukuyama, ever talks about our posthuman future. It's like it's totally just been memory hold. And, it's kind of one of those cases where it's like, a lot of the debates in America are between people who acknowledge fact A and say, but it's a good thing, and acknowledge fact A and say it's a bad thing. Well, yeah, post-humanity is on the table in the United States of America. But then if you look over at China, well, there's something of the same sort of conversation going on, where it's like, well, do we need to merge with the technology? And do we need to create this new form of digital governance that's going to be fundamentally different? And are we going to kind of be wiring everyone together in a sort of collective consciousness? And then you got Russia in between the US and China. China surviving, quote unquote, communist power, recognizably communist in some ways, but definitely not in others relative to Western communism. And then you got the US, quote unquote capitalist power, recognizably capitalist in some respects, but perhaps not so much anymore in others. And Russia's standing here going like, well, we tried communism and we got our asses kicked. And then we got a taste of capitalism in 1991. And well, that wasn't so hot either. And the Chinese are moving relentlessly in this very technological direction. And the Americans, oh no, we can't lose to China, so we're going to have to also move in this relentlessly technological direction. And the Russians are kind of standing there in between these, these two hyperpowers, wondering what their role is in it all, if any. That seems to me to be really important, regardless of who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. I mean, I think I've made my political position on Russia pretty clear over the course of the show. This war is bad, should never have happened. But nevertheless, Russia is a unique civilization state, like India, Israel, there are a few of them. And it does have sort of interestingly unique things to say about how to deal with the challenge posed by technological advancement to the basics of human life, to our biology, to our religiosity, to philosophy. Some technologists are content to more or less see all of that swept away, and for some fundamentally new kind of post-human order to be erected. It seems like in China and the U.S., the post-humanists really are. I don't know if they have the upper hand quite yet, but they're on the march. In Russia, that doesn't seem to be the case. Why do you think that is?
Well, Russia, look, for me, these questions about human destiny and post-humanism and those possibilities, they're crystallized in the figure of Dugan. Okay, so I have reason to believe, and some evidence over the last 10 years, that it's fair to say we can extrapolate. Let's say he's an expositor of this position for those people in Russia who want to preserve the human essence. So it's a difficult question. What would put us on one or another side of the line? Because you might think that the human being is characterized by freedom with respect to our nature. You know, freedom with respect to nature as such, which is expressed in technology, and freedom with respect to our own nature, which is expressed in biotechnology to a certain extent. That we can remake ourselves may seem to be a sign of our dignity if you think that freedom is what primarily characterizes us. And if you think that the free technological reinvention of the human being is therefore a sign, posthumanism is the fulfillment of humanity, if humanity is primarily its free technological conquest of nature.
Becoming what you really are.
Yeah, so there's something to that. And we have reason to believe that we are free beings, free with respect to nature, and that technology is the embodiment of that freedom. Now, on the other hand, we have an awareness of sacred restraints and limits, as Leo Strauss talked about. We have some sense that there's a world bigger than us, a world that transcends us, and that it's not our business to try to conquer it or to master it. And I think that if you can imagine, this is kind of when you said that all the disciplines are entangled now in this fascinating way. I think one way of looking at the world is that different metaphysical or philosophical positions are being mapped out geopolitically. And we're just able to see how they play out because they're expressed on this horizontal plane of world politics. I mean, that was true in some sense of the bipolar world. It wasn't just economic systems. It's also deep philosophies about what it is to be human, what it is to be, what is time, what is history, what is the significance of all of these things? Is eternity a relevant factor or not for humanity? And all the rest of it. So Russia seems right now, at least in the philosophical dimension, to be occupying that place on the world metaphysical map that has staked its claim to the defense of the human essence as being something other than free technological conquest of nature. And that's going to express itself, you would imagine, in its attitude towards religion, and its attitude towards society, and its attitude towards political forms, and its attitude towards tradition, and all of these other elements, which it is expressing itself as a defense, not at least nominally rhetorically, a defense of the traditional family, defense of traditional religion in the face of the march of progressive liberation from all collective identity and all external forms of authority. In Dugin's philosophy, that's also very much represented. He draws on the whole tradition of phenomenology, from Brentano to Heidegger and beyond, and many other thinkers as well. It's a surprisingly good and deep and thoughtful lecturer in just the purely academic sense as well, who's defending the idea that to be human is more than, as I say, if the one view is that we fulfill our humanity at the same time as we destroy it, which is represented, in Kojev and other thinkers as well, in Dugan, that is not quite the case. We need to preserve our humanity. It's at risk it's on the brink of destruction. I should say, one thing that attracts me personally to this problem that's not as straightforward as here are the nihilists and here are the traditionalists, here are the people who want to destroy humanity, here are the people who want to preserve it, is there's a big puzzle, as I say, a sort of metaphysical, theological, philosophical puzzle. Why should it be the case that the human being can destroy himself in the first place? So independently of nihilism and tradition, there's that weird question mark space, that very strange question, which Dugan has devoted several books to and lectures to, and I'm writing about at the moment, he calls the radical subject. So that's actually interesting as well. But yeah, Russia is taking that place. And unlike some other regimes that are doing it sort of for their own religion, like the Islamic world, or that are doing it for their own class, Dugan is trying to articulate this as a generalizable philosophical and political theory.
Well, and what's especially intriguing, I think, and I think to a degree this accounts for some of the uncanny experience of Americans going sort of oh no, do we have to care about Russian philosophy now? As if life hasn't gotten uncomfortable enough. Now we actually have to pay it. Europe has really fallen off in this area of late. And Americans, Canadians, Brits used to be able to rely on really strong philosophical conversation partners to hammer out our kind of place in the world. On the continent, you go back to the 90s, to the 80s. France alone, just that whole kind of wave of Girard, Virilio, Baudrillard, like really, really top-notch guys who were ahead of the curve, who saw a lot of this stuff coming with regard to technology and alienation and the transformation of the human subject into an object, all that kind of stuff. That wave has come and gone, and there really just hasn't been much to replace it. Even if you look at, kind of the avant-garde on the philosophical right in Europe. I mean, guys are just talking about futurism again. It's sort of like, man, like, is this really all that's left in the toy box? And so, on top of all of this weirdness that Russia's experiencing, being kind of, geographically, but also in a way, culturally between the U.S. and China, it's kind of stepping into this void where the Europeans, a lot of Europeans, aren't very comfortable with technology sort of eating the human race. And a lot of Europe right now, in terms of policy, is kind of stuck in this loop of like, well, we might not be the biggest innovators, but gosh darn it, we can be the super regulators. And that's kind of how we're going to attack this. They're not attacking it through philosophy. They're not even really trying to, who are the heirs of Kojev, to take just one example? Who's really stepping up and saying, hey, this neoliberal project, it's actually best for human beings, and I'm going to lay out how that is. No, you got Zizek out there who's kind of doing his thing, but he really is kind of more of a carnival figure even now, with whatever respect he's managed to gain. What happened to the Europeans? What happened to that philosophical tradition?
So in my view, it's a function of post-war intellectual history. I mean, it is just a fact that some of the greatest thinkers were on the right, and then the right got discredited as a function of fascism and Nazism. Overzealous post-war liberalism made any intellectual effort on the right taboo. And as a result, philosophy came to an end. I mean, that's roughly the way I see it. It's been outlawed to be a genuine philosopher in Europe unless you're philosophizing in the wake of the end of metaphysics as a deconstructionist or as some other sort of, as you put it, avant-garde. Left, I would say, leftist thinker. They put out many of them. They all published with Verso, and some of them are worth reading. But they operate under the shared presumption in a kind of post-Heideggerian world that metaphysics or traditional philosophy is over, and they miss a very important step of Heidegger's thought that Dugan puts at the center of his work, which is the idea of another beginning. So Heidegger, he not only talked about the end of metaphysics, but the other beginning of philosophy. And most of the European and French, not to mention German philosophers, where Heidegger is completely taboo, have shut all of that down in Heidegger, because the worry is that if you talk about the things that Heidegger talked about, you're going to do the things that Heidegger did. Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party, therefore you can't do that. And this sort of implicit and explicit propaganda war against philosophy in Europe, really, which said you can have any car you want as long as it's this car and this color. You can have any thought that you want as long as it's leftist thought and it has to be very sort of specific jargon and so on. That has castrated the intellectual life of the European peoples. And unfortunately, that's a vital power. You can't cut off the intellect and expect the people to thrive. And it's not that everybody is an intellectual, but the whole body doesn't have to be a beating heart, but it has to have a beating heart. The whole people don't have to be intellectuals, but they have to have philosophy. That gives them life. So the criminalization of philosophy has been a big factor, I think, in the decline of Europe's contribution to these questions. And this is where Dugan came on the scene for me in a huge way. It was actually the question of the geopolitics of the reception of Heidegger. So people may not know, but Heidegger is widely acknowledged as the greatest thinker of the 20th century, if not of all time. Okay, Heidegger is the giant among giants of philosophers. Let's say Plato and Heidegger. Okay, there are many philosophers, they're all outstanding, but Heidegger is among the most outstanding. And he had a reception history. Leo Strauss, highly affected by Heidegger, he took his insights into the problems that Heidegger raised and addressed those problems in a specific way in America. Derrida and the French thinkers, the French, to quote one Heidegger scholar, were dominated by Heidegger's thought in the 80s. It was all a response to Heidegger. And so on in some other places as well. But because they had to deliberately skew their interpretation of Heidegger in a certain direction, they had a very distorted encounter with him. And now what makes Russia amazing in this history, again, as a sort of geopolitics of the reception of philosophy, is that they were excluded from having to do that. You can see why the Germans would have to water down their Heidegger. You can see why the French would have to. And you can even see why the German emigres into America, all the more so the Jewish German emigres had to do so. But somehow Heidegger escapes into the Russian reception. And Dugin, before he's important to me as a thinker of Russian civilizational identity and as Putin's brain, he's fascinating in this philosophical history of where Heidegger was allowed to come to life again. You know, Heidegger's the most important thinker for Dugin. He says so himself. He says he's the deepest foundation of the fourth political theory, and he's devoted several books to him. So that's how I see it. I mean, Europe is under the shameful shadow of recent world history. And that shadow has made them nervous about philosophizing, I think, and about the dangers that are associated with philosophizing. And they have really constrained their thought into some interesting, but nevertheless limited domains. And so if we see echoes, if we hear echoes and we see signs of the resurgence of philosophy elsewhere, those of us who love intellectual life and think that it is the beating heart of a people, we got to perk up to that, you know? So that's one of the reasons why I think Russia becomes interesting in a way that's not true. I mean, we haven't read, I happen to know some Russian. I was able to discover Dugan. Maybe if I knew all the languages in the world, we would discover amazing thinkers in other places. But he just happens to have popped up as a unique expression of philosophy outside of the dominant themes of Western thought today. And for that sake, independently of the Russia connection, he's important.
So let's move west then and spend some time with the Germans. Thinking of Heidegger, obviously National Socialism earned a very bad reputation. At the same time, what Heidegger famously leaves us with, only a God can save us, in some ways seems to be a repudiation of philosophy without taking the next step and saying like, okay, well then which God, you know, don't leave us hanging. What is that new beginning that Heidegger proposes to offer us? And if it's so important, why didn't he just come out and say what it was?
Well, first, when he says, as you rightly point out, only a God can save us, we need to know what a God is for Heidegger, what it means to talk about a God. And in Heidegger, nothing is so straightforward, because you could say that roughly for him, there are two languages. There's the language of the first history of philosophy, from Plato to Nietzsche, where we have many familiar concepts and terms and ways of interpreting the world. And then there's a new language that he's struggling to bring into being, the language of another beginning of philosophy. And what God or the divine means in that second world is not self-evident. So for example, he says, sometimes he writes about God, a God, and sometimes he writes about the gods. But he says in one of his books, don't think that I mean many gods. When I say gods, I don't mean many gods, Heidegger says. Now that's weird, because when you hear someone say gods, you think they mean many gods. Polytheism,
that would mean
right?
A few gods, right?
Exactly. Well, you would think, well, not even. He says, I'm using this to indicate that I don't think we should apply the realm of number and calculation to the realm of the divine. And you think, all right, that wasn't self-evident. That's not the first thing you think about when somebody says gods. But when he explains what he means, then you say, okay, what is the relationship of the realm of calculation to the realm of the divine? So Heidegger's like that. And nothing's self-evident in what he says unless you go through the process of thinking with him about what he's trying to say. So what is he trying to say? Another beginning of philosophy. Roughly, I'll try to do it as quickly as I can, Heidegger believes that the crisis of modernity and the crisis of the West is first and foremost a philosophical crisis. Okay, that history is the history of philosophy for him. In this sense, he's a philosophical supremacist. And the meaning of the history of philosophy is that being itself, which is the target of philosophical thinking, for Heidegger to philosophize is to think about being, to think the meaning of being, to try to understand what is being. In the course of the first history of philosophy, being has hid itself. It has left the stage. It has alienated us from it and occluded itself from us. And over the course of that history, there's been a big separation between humanity and somehow our rootedness in being, or our relationship to being. So it's a history of alienation, it's a history of uprooting, and it's a history of being's concealment. But we don't know that until we get to the end and then reflect on it and reincorporate being's concealment into our thinking. Now that sounds maybe abstract or strange or just like words, but for Heidegger, the destiny of the West depends on what I just said, on understanding what happened and on reappropriating those parts of ourselves and of our thought and of being itself that were not captured by the first history of philosophy. As I say, it's opaque, but it's his project, and he has several books about it, and he dedicated his life to it. And some people resonate with that, and some people don't. The people who do resonate with it, he thinks are going to be the few and the rare. That's his phrase. And they are the sole possibility of a future for the West. The West, as I say, if the West has its if what it means to be the West is primarily philosophical, which for him it is, it's not primarily Christianity. Now, people may take issues with that, but I think he roughly agrees with the Nietzschean view that Christianity is Platonism for the people. In other words, what's most important about the history of the West is Plato, not Jesus, for Heidegger.
So, right. I mean, another way of phrasing this is, does this all just not issue out of an effort by a people to try to escape their Christian heritage?
No, I don't think so, because let's say the question of Christianity, the meaning of Christianity, the place of Christianity in our world and in the world as such, obviously, almost inexhaustible topic. But if we isolate just a certain component of it and we say, is Christian thought, has it been in any significant way implicated in Heidegger's account of the philosophers? Like in other words, does what he says about Plato actually affect what we think about Christian thought, Christian doctrine, dogma, theology? And I think the acknowledged answer is that yes, Christian thought owes a lot to Platonism, to Neoplatonism, at times to Aristotle, to Aristotelianism, and therefore more generally to philosophy, and therefore to the basic concepts of philosophy that Heidegger is asking us to reconsider. So I would say it allows us to ask the question, if Heidegger is right about philosophy, what does that mean for Christianity? I think that's fair to say. And there have been, for example, Jewish thinkers who read Heidegger, despite the fact that he was a Nazi. And they say, look, what he says about metaphysics does give us access to understanding Jewish theology, Jewish mysticism, and Jewish thought in a way that's helpful. And so Christianity would have the same sort of opportunity there if it wanted to. I mean, the intersection of religious thought and philosophical notions, that's attested to. There's a long tradition there. So it's like if you tweak either side of the equation, then maybe the other one changes. And so people who like that sort of intellectual exercise or operation and who think that a lot depends on it, a lot is at stake, would have to do that. But it is true that for Heidegger, Christianity is part of the first history of philosophy. It's therefore subject to the criticisms that he makes about that history. Its interpretation of God is for him metaphysical, and therefore, as I say, subject to certain limitations that he thinks belongs to the history of metaphysics. And that the Christian task would be to see, to object to that if possible, or to ignore it. But here's the difficulty. It truly is a difficulty to ignore Heidegger if you care at all about philosophy, the life of the mind, and that whole tradition. Because as Leo Strauss said, he said, we have to make a very great effort to defend rational liberalism. Here's the great problem. We're going to need the help of a great thinker. And the only great thinker in our time is Heidegger, who criticized that. So it's like you have this mountain that you have to overcome called Heidegger. And you can either just try to, turn your back on it or go around it or under it or over it. But that's the task. I mean, that's Heidegger's significance for our time. He's not just some third-rate, fourth-rate, insignificant figure. All around the world, in Iran, in Russia, in America, Germany, France, he's been acknowledged as the person who poses the greatest challenge for our time.
Well, so just to go back to Dugan for a minute, I mean, he knows this as well as you or I. If you go back and look at the history of Eastern Orthodox theology, what you see is a lot of saying like, no, Plato was wrong. No, these vain philosophers, they did not have Christ, and so they spent a lot of time trying to understand the nature of being, and it led them to some sterile places because they're kind of stuck in the realm of the mind, and they didn't get down into the realm of the heart. And so, say what you will about the intelligence of the ancient Greeks, of the Socratics. Say what you will about their cognizance of the form of the good. But in the end, this is not a sufficient guide toward understanding the nature of being and living well. If you're Dugan and you are an heir or trying to be an heir to Nietzsche and Heidegger on the one hand, and then Russian Orthodoxy on the other, that might be a tough square to circle. And what I see, even right now in the US, among a lot of the younger online right, is, it's like the two wolves meme, where it's like these guys, they see Nietzsche on the one hand and they see Christ on the other, and they really just spend what seems like a lot of energy trying to figure out who really wins, or whether you can somehow squish them together. What does Dugan say about that dilemma, and maybe if there's a way out of it?
Yeah, so it is true. Dugan is a Christian. He's an Orthodox Christian. He's an old believer, which I understand one of the sects of Russian Orthodoxy.
Yes.
And at the
Very
same time,
unusual still to this day.
And at the same time, he's a follower of Heidegger. That's true. And he gives his full resources to the articulation of each of those positions, as well as to their interaction. So he's an experimental thinker. He does like the idea of trying to see what tendencies of Christian thought can be expressed in a way that's consistent with Heidegger's insights and intuitions, and which ones can't. Now, Dugan is also indebted to a non-Heideggerian strand of thought called traditionalism, with René Guénon and Julius Evola, popular among some circles. And he applies the insights that they develop to Christian history and to Christian dogmatics and all of that. He lectures on and has written about the philosophy of the early church fathers, of the relationship of various forms of Christian mysticism, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, to the phenomenological tradition. So he's very active in developing what he thinks is an appropriate account of Christian life, Christian worship, Christian thought, Christian dogma. And he does say about Heidegger, so let's say, here's the sort of link. Heidegger has a criticism of Plato. If we see Christianity as Platonism for the people, then Heidegger's criticism of Plato is a criticism of Christianity, and that door is closed. Dugan says that there is another dimension to Plato's thought that Heidegger's criticism does not reach. And that dimension of Plato's thought is the one that for him breathes through, you could say, the Christian tradition, as well as other forms of theology, mysticism, esotericism, and so on, that he defends in his other works. That's kind of the apophatic or mystical Plato. So Heidegger is critical of, and rightly critical of, according to Dugan, the kind of what he calls closed Platonism, where what's most important is the ideas in the allegory of the cave, that the ideas sort of block out the sky, and that you have this long tradition of interpreting the ideas as beings and so on. Won't get into details. But the idea is that Heidegger's criticism applies to that, but it doesn't apply to the open Platonism, mystical Platonism, Neoplatonism. And he finds evidence of that in Orthodoxy and, as I say, in other elements of Christian thought, as well as non-Christian thought. Dugan is himself a Christian, but as a wide thinker, he writes about, for example, Heidegger and Shi'ism, Heidegger and Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. So he's interested in the whole problem of philosophy and religion, not just the more limited problem of Heidegger and Christianity. But within the more limited problem, he does have a defense of what Christianity is and can be and must be, and he always identifies himself as a Christian thinker. I will say, in my view, he's subject to some of the ambiguities that come from a theologian being a philosopher or a philosopher being a theologian, where you do wonder at times, like Leo Strauss, the great Leo Strauss, said, you can really only be one or the other. You can be a philosopher who's open to the challenge of revelation, or you could be, a believer who's open to the challenge of philosophy, but you can't quite be both in the same way at the same time. And I think that Dugan at times does try to be both at the same time. He thinks that philosophy and theology are more intimately related than some other thinkers do, and that's a position worth considering as well. But yeah, his Heideggerianism does not pose a challenge to his Christianity because, as I said, he has this interpretation that allows them both to occupy a place of mutual influence.
Okay, well, at the end of the day, when I spend my time on the internet and I follow these currents of thought, it's really not a lot of guys debating Heidegger. It's really not a lot of guys debating Dugan. It's all Nietzsche all the time. And not just Nietzsche, the philologist, but Nietzsche as a portal to a resurrected paganism. And not the paganism of Apollo and Diana or whatever, but the paganism of war, of the god of war. We see it with Bronze Age Pervert and some of these other guys. And it really seems to be, a preoccupation shading into an obsession, just like younger guys who really do not find philosophy or theology as attractive as the kind of pagan poetics of strength and vitality and force. Is this going to last? Is it something that people should be concerned about in a country like the United States of America? I mean, this is certainly not a pacifist country, but one where, we've seen how political Nietzscheanism has played out elsewhere. Not a very happy ending. Do we have to go through it too?
Well, I'm not sure. It's a possibility worth considering. What would the full-blown adoption of Nietzscheanism mean in this context? And is it possible? What would it look like? I can say, before I say a little bit about Bronze Age pervert and that tendency towards a kind of vitalism, strength, and life, which I think are sort of the key concepts there, I do think that another way in which Heidegger is relevant even to the Nietzsche conversation is that as the next great philosopher after Nietzsche, as somebody who dedicated 4 volumes to the interpretation of Nietzsche, reflected on his significance constantly, Heidegger does possibly present an alternative to the Nietzschean spirit of vitality and life. And not that alternative is not, the degenerate leftism or the sort of spineless liberalism. So people think there are other alternatives to Nietzsche, but they're not appealing or attractive to those followers of Nietzsche. But I think that the debate between Heidegger and Nietzsche has to replay itself. I mean, people are aware of that debate outside of the United States who follow these sorts of things and who think that the philosophical ideas have political significance, but it hasn't quite yet reached North America. So I think that lies in the future more than the victory of Nietzscheanism. I think the intellectual encounter of Heidegger and Nietzsche is the most interesting potential in the future at the level of ideas. But again, that's a long way off because there's still preliminary steps.
Well, it's difficult though, isn't it? Because it's not just a debate. It's also a debate about debate. Given the force of technology, given the way that so much of the early modern to late modern intellectual history of the West is now more or less openly reviled by people on the left and on the right, by traditionalists and Christians as much as radicals and atheists. The force of Nietzsche in this moment is really one that goes beyond debate and that says, look around you, what has debate done for you lately? What has analysis done for you? Discourse, the whole kind of apparatus of classical liberalism and contemporary liberalism that follows the line of, John Stuart Mill and some others, which is, look, if you get the smartest people together in a room and you make sure that it doesn't descend into fistfights, and you just let them start talking, they will come to an agreement about what the truth is. And that is, in fact, where truth comes from. And once you have that, then you have everything. All that is now very much under attack, very subject to doubt. I think technology is driving that. And in that kind of milieu, Heidegger seems to be at a disadvantage to Nietzsche, where Nietzsche says, well, I have poems too, like I wrote other stuff and it's not just all about philosophy. And the future of mankind is not going to hinge on the outcome of an intellectual debate.
Yeah, there's some truth to that, although we should understand that Nietzsche and the most prominent Nietzscheans in the US context, like Bronze Age pervert, they write books, they write exhortations in part to philosophy. They're aware of these philosophers. They write about Leo Strauss, they write about Kojève. They're very familiar with all of these debates.
They do, although Bap, likes to insist, like, I am just a comedian, I am not the real philosopher.
Yeah, but that's fine because philosophers have always had to wear a mask and they've always had to double themselves if they wanted to have any sort of political relevance or significance, because the people don't resonate with philosophy, but they resonate with certain dramatic personae that can be invented by philosophers for purposes of exhortation or comedy, comic relief or anything else. So he can say what he says, but again, we have all the signs to think that even the Nietzschean spirit, Nietzsche is a philosophical supremacist, whatever else he may be. And that's why you can't just wish the philosophy away. But the fact that there's this interminable liberal dialogue that doesn't lead to decision, or you could say that political action has to be more than just mere rhetoric, more than just talking. We don't necessarily have to look at Nietzsche and therefore the dark possibilities of German thought to see that, because Plato and Aristotle and much of the classical political tradition give us examples that are equivalent, if not better. I say if not better because you have more of the presence of political moderation and of sound common sense in the classical example. So in one world, this is maybe idealistic or utopian, but in one world, people who are attracted to Nietzsche, because they think that now they are going to become supermen of great strength and vitality, and they're going to tear down everything that's ugly and put up things that are beautiful, which, by the way, if they can replace ugliness with beauty, that wouldn't be so bad. But in the best case scenario, the encounter with Nietzsche leads to a reconsideration of the whole tradition of political philosophy, not just of Mill and not just other forms of parliamentary democracy and things that are considered no good, but a return to the sound common sense of the tradition of classical political rationalism. That's open. A corrective of the things that have really gone off the rails, a replacement of ugliness by beauty, as I say, a replacement of, how could you put it, a lack of life with vitality. Those things are not bad. It's when it becomes a kind of exaggerated, immoderate pagan force, pagan in the specifically bad sense here, that we've abandoned all aims to understand and orient ourselves politically through reason. I would say one of the greatest examples of this analysis, in my opinion, is Leo Strauss. There's a specific thing I want to point to that he said. He said there's a crisis of modernity is the crisis of modern rationalism. And many people deal with the crisis of rationalism by running into irrationalism. They abandon reason. But he said, no, pause and understand. The crisis of modern rationalism means there's another form. There's a pre-modern rationalism that didn't culminate in ugliness, that didn't culminate in just yapping, that didn't leave us with no guide for political action, that didn't denigrate everything holy and excellent and drag it through the mud. And if we can correctly, diagnose the talking class, or if we can just reorient ourselves, the acting class, away from the crisis of modern rationalism towards the promise of the alternatives, which can be, as I say, a sound moderate thought, then there's some hope for the future. Running headlong into the arms of irrationalism, of just a passionate rejection of bourgeois and leftist morality, just saying the most important thing is our commitment to an idea, regardless of what the idea is, as long as we're willing to kill and die for something that shows that we have spine. Strauss, Plato, Aristotle, they remind us, now it matters what you're willing to die for, not just that you're willing to die, what you're willing to kill for, not just that you're willing to kill. And the greatest figure in Western civilization, short of or equivalent to, depending on where you stand, Jesus himself, would be Socrates, who's notoriously ugly, but even someone as beautiful as Alcibiades could see through Socrates' ugliness to the beauty of his speeches. Alcibiades is a man of action. So, it's a big problem, but the risk and the danger is to become a misalogue. Reason and talking is just mere yapping. I have to go act. Maybe, but you have to act with understanding. And there are still teachers who allow us to do that and to make sense of what it means to do that.
Well, I was going to close out by asking you why you bothered to teach philosophy at all rather than to just study it, but I think you answered the question about it as well as anyone could have. So, Michael Millerman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, that's all the time we got. Till next time around. If you're watching on YouTube over there, smash that like, crush the subscribe button, comment below, tell me who you'd like to see me interview next time around. Until then, this is Zero Hour. I'm James Poulos. May God have mercy on us all.